Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Competitive Enablement Show on the Compete Network, powered by Klue, the podcast for product marketers and competitive professionals looking to give their companies a competitive advantage. I'm your host, Adam McQueen, and today we were joined by yet another duo from Klue. Some experts from the customer success team, Sophie Baker and Honami Kawamura. Sophie and Honami are great. I love having them on the show because their job is to help customers build better compete programs. They've seen hundreds of them. And so they shared some of their best tips, advice, things they've seen, things to do, things not to do to build a healthy compete program. And a lot of that revolved around earning adoption. Ben?
It's their number one goal, apart from the success of your overall compete program. They want your compete content to be the best it can be, and they want it to get used and adopted so that your team will keep coming back for more. Hearing them talk, it's so clear that they know exactly what they're doing. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but there's just something so powerful about hearing from the people who do it day in, day out, who know their stuff, and they speak with such confidence. I was really impressed. I mean, we talked to them around the office and you already get that sense, but this was really, I thought, a good conversation. Some real tactical stuff. We need to bring them back on the pod and do more customer success stuff because they're just so great.
100%. And for the listeners, I think one of the cool things again is that they get to see so many programs. They can kind of give advice for a listener right now that's looking to launch a program, looking to improve. Maybe they're struggling a little bit, struggling to get some traction. They see such a broad case of compete programs, folks running compete in different roles, that they can provide sort of this consultative advice across the broad spectrum that they see. And so Honami specifically shows sort of these 4 steps midway through the conversation. So make sure you get to that part where there's like these 4 steps that really just to kick things off and to put yourself in a really strong position to launch a compete program successfully and be able to report on it, impact revenue, all of that. She shares this really tight 4-step framework that you should be following. And I can't recommend that part enough. Plus, there's plenty of anecdotes of just things they've seen customers do. Love hearing sort of these specific examples, stories that listeners can pick up, take for themselves. There's some Klue-inspired board games or SKO happening. Some interesting things with like Intel Digest and competitive newsletters. There's a host of things
theme.
You can.
There's a Batman. There's a Batman theme in terms of, how you can make it a little bit fun. So like you said, Adam, like they've seen so many different programs, different industries, really across the board, a few different, every shape and size of a compete program. And the fact that they've got this knowledge in their head to sort of synthesize it all and pull out what the best practices are, I think is so valuable.
For sure. And one little plug before we get into the conversation on the topic of adoption. We dropped an article on the Klue account, our By the Number series, where we dive into some of the data that our competitive enablement consultant experts collect on maturity assessments, battle card audits, and we found 4 common mistakes we see typically behind why battle cards aren't getting adopted, used by your end users, and how you can fix them. So if you're thinking about adoption, if that's why you tuned into this episode, make sure to check out that article too in the show notes. And with that all said, let's get into our conversation with Sophie and Honami. All right, today we are joined by 2 experts on the Klue customer success team. We've got Sophie Baker and Honami Kawamura with me. Sophie and Honami, thank you so much for joining me.
Awesome. Thanks for wanting us.
Sophie's been begging to be on the podcast, listeners.
It's a big dream of mine.
It's off the bucket list now. We've relented. Producer Ben put it on the calendar. Sophie will be on the show, and she's brought Honami along with her. She needed, quote unquote, the big guns with her for this episode. So I am very excited to have both of you on today because, as being a part of the customer success team at Klue, you get to see the inside of hundreds of compete programs, and you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, first things first, what are some of the common traits, common things you two have seen within businesses and Compete programs within that business that are successfully closing their competitive revenue gap today?
Well, I think I kind of think about Compete programs in two areas of what makes it successful. There's the content, because content is king. Without good content, no one's going to use Klue or any Compete program or tool. And then there's the delivery and enablement side of it. So if now that we have this good content, how do we make sure that it's in the right places at the right time and it's easy for people to use it what they need? And so with customers that I think are really doing well on the content side is, I would say, feedback. So, there is a myriad of best practices that, we can provide at Klue. We have tons of Klue customers that have shared their experience. So there's a whole host of different tactics that we can apply. But without seller and end user feedback, it's really like a spray and pray approach. So we want to make sure that whatever we do is landing with sellers, it's valuable for them. And that's really key to any kind of Compete program.
Sophie?
You can see why I brought the big guns here. She said it all. I definitely agree. I think another key thing is don't boil the ocean. I think when folks hear competitive enablement program, it can feel overwhelming. You're involving a lot of different groups. You're getting feedback from different areas. And the beauty of a program is you really can start small and build out from there. So what I see folks doing when they're being successful is they're first and foremost having fun with it. So they're not just going, oh my goodness, we have all these things to do and we are going to check this off and we're going to make sure there's just a whole data dump of things. Content is king. They make that content fun. And then they celebrate both the big and small wins and take the time to look at what are the things that we are looking to achieve on a smaller and a longer term basis. And taking the time to structure their competitive enablement plan around that and be realistic. What time do you have to put towards Compete? And who else can you bring into the fold to have fun with you while you build out the program? So in a nutshell, celebrate both the big and small wins. Don't boil the ocean, and have fun as you're doing it. There's a lot of cool things that can come out along the way.
I was snooping in on some gong calls, and I was hearing an awesome story that we'll get into, Honami, about sort of, I think to your point around building sort of short-term, long-term goals, sort of almost like a plan on how you're going to crack that nut. Before we get into that, you mentioned making content fun, making the process fun. Do either of you have some stories? Is there some like unique ways you've seen customers deliver intel in a fun way, get that sort of feedback, stakeholder buy-in? Are there a few things either of you have seen during your time?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of customers have fun at places like SKO or any kind of enablement sessions, rather than it just be a dry, hey, here's a presentation. I know Pat Wall at Imperva recently shared about his cocktails and Compete session, which I think is maybe the epitome of putting fun in Compete. But it also doesn't have to be that big or that complicated. A customer that comes to mind, something that they were doing really well is just involving sellers in the whole process of their program. So from the development to when they've rolled it out. And so they would actually have monthly syncs with top sellers, solutions engineers, people that really knew their staff. And instead of it being a one-way street of, hey, here's our Compete content, they were really including them in that process. So not only, hey, here's our content, but hearing what they had to say, hearing intel from them as well. It was a great opportunity for the sellers to actually share that in field feedback back. And that can be really fun for sellers because it's not, again, a one-way street. It feels like a two-way conversation. They've got skin in the game now. And it's something that they can feel proud of when it's shared with other team members.
Yeah, I would add to using different platforms to talk about Compete. So, what comes to mind, obviously, is Slack. That can be a really fun place to just start sharing ideas. Or, I've seen different organizations, someone might just throw a question into their competitive enablement channel and say, what are you hearing? And that's where you can start to just respond, quick back and forth ideas. You can also just become a little bit more organic with it as opposed to it being so structured. And then to Honami's point, I've seen a lot of really wild stuff. I've seen Batman themes. I've seen folks create the Klue board game and do scavenger hunts. I've seen all sorts of stuff. When you use the digest, you can have a lot of fun with that too, because we all get lots of different emails, and we get different updates through Slack. But what if your compete email is the thing that stands out and folks look forward to opening, and they know they're going to get a creative nugget, they might get to actually be involved in it. They can be really simple ways to just lean into the fun aspect of it. So yeah, I think there's different avenues, sort of bigger and smaller, but it can be light.
Okay, so let me go. I was gonna actually go into this a little bit later, but let's do it now since you brought up Intel Digest newsletters. Like, I think the things both of you are talking about is this sort of all these different kind of touch points or ways that you get the organization involved. Like, it's a visibility thing, an awareness thing, getting people bought into compete, how it helps them in their role. And I think Honami mentioned this offline. It's like there's no quick hacks. It's like really just being prominent across these different touch points. But tactically speaking, for folks that are listening, if they're Klue customers running an Intel Digest, or even if you're not and you're building your own competitive newsletter, in what ways have you seen people utilize that to the best of its ability? So if you mentioned there, standing out in an inbox or providing that little bit of value, is there any examples you've seen over your career with customers that have done something unique or just something that's been really valuable to helping stakeholders?
I know something that we do internally at Klue, and we often share as a best practice or shout outs. And that can be, again, big and small. It could be, hey, thanks for sharing this intel, so-and-so. And that can get people excited and encourages people to continue to share that field intel, sharing wins. So that's a really easy way for you to get that exposure and create excitement, have some fun. Hey, we recently closed this big deal against this competitor. Give that rep a shout out. So those are a couple things that in terms of the digest content that you could certainly include. I've also seen customers use other kinds of content within the digest itself, like video. They'll say, instead of just all being written, they'll insert small videos where they actually walk through the content. We know how with TikTok and all these other types of platforms out there, people's attention spans are short. So utilizing anything you can to capture attention, get excitement up, can really pay off in the long term.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember you can't just send an email or a message and expect that everyone just suddenly sees it, knows it's there, thinks about it all the time. We are getting inundated with information. So brand yourself. Why not? This is sort of back to the fun part too, is you can name your compete program. You can set reminders to folks, whether it's, through different channels internally. Go where your folks are often communicating and say, this is going to be coming out at this day, at this time. Keep that succinct so folks know when to expect it. And here's what you can expect. Reminder, intel coming in 24 hours, those types of things. Whether we want to believe it or not, we sometimes need to hear something 100 times before we actually think of it and it becomes a habit. And so I think often what I see folks do is believing, well, I sent it, I did it, and it's super exciting. And that could be true, but you have to keep reminding folks and then playing, to Honami's point, I would echo that. Play with the types of formats. Some people, I know when I receive, video, I'm often sort of scrolling through, whereas when I get text, I like to read things. Some folks, they'll immediately open a video or respond to imagery. So different ways you can slice it.
That's interesting. I think the way when you're talking about like the different formats too, it's you see it like in our own Klue Slack channel. Like there's a lot of messages going out, and to think that I think you're after marketing's heart here, Sophie, with the like 100. I think it is something. There's a stat. Someone's made a stat out there somewhere that it's like it takes X amount of times to like repeat a message for it to sink in. It's why companies have slogans, why they have catchphrases, and they repeat that across advertising marketing. So your point around branding, compete, and in your world, it's, well, no duh, I know this insight, or I know this thing about a competitor. But when you're able to think about from another, like a stakeholder's perspective, aren't in that every single day, aren't thinking that, it's like, oh, right, you do need to repeat this message. And can you do it in creative ways? Can you do it in different forms, even getting up into meetings and sharing with people? I think that's a great point. And just repeating the message, but being creative with how you repeat that message. Is kind of segues into the not so good side of things you've seen. Maybe some of the regular or common errors or hiccups you've seen with PMMs and compete leads when they're building their compete programs.
I'll double down on the piece on just having to tell folks and remind folks about things many, many times. It's kind of like training a puppy. It's like you get them, here's the treat, and like, sit, you did it, yay. And then they're off again because there's so much going on. So you can almost think of it like that. How are you getting them back into that habit? It's, our minds are all the work we're doing. It's like we're puppies needing to be, just bring them back. And so I think really when I see things not going well, it's because you're not keeping CI top of mind. And more importantly, it's not just saying, here's this thing around compete and you should know about it. It's why should you care? Why does the business care? And then why should you personally care? How is it going to personally impact the audience that is actually using the information? I think that's really important.
Honami, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think what Sophie said is spot on. In terms of what apart from reminding folks, going back more to the content and feedback piece, making sure that you're like, even if we work with a lot of product marketers and CI practitioners who often have a very small team or sometimes just one person, and we get it. You're spread thin. You don't have a ton of time. How do you make your impact with whatever capacity or resources you have? And you don't have to do it alone. So, for example, like a common mistake that we hear with battle cards from sellers is like, hey, this is marketing lingo, which is kind of that red flag that gets raised a lot. It's like, well, this is maybe sounds great on a landing page, but how do we actually prove that? How do we tell the story as a seller? And as a product marketer, if maybe you don't know the answer to that, and that's totally fine. Instead of brushing it under the rug or feeling like you have to figure it out yourself, try to like incorporate other stakeholders. So ask those top sellers, hey, I'm struggling with understanding how you would deliver this in the field. Tell me, how do you deposition this competitor? How do you speak to this point? It could be bringing in your product leaders who know the competitor's features inside out, leverage their expertise. So even if you are, the only person that is creating a battle card or owns compete, quote unquote, you're never alone. So bring in those other stakeholders and don't be afraid to do that.
Something just to add on to that, something I've seen resonates well when working with customers is to think about it, especially when you're owning a program. Think about it as if you took your top seller and said, okay, on Friday, we're doing a lunch and learn with that seller. If everyone showed up and there was a slide that said, here's why I won this deal, and the deal said customer success, product, and pricing, folks would be pretty upset they went to that lunch and learn. What if instead they showed up and that individual is saying, here's how I won. So I know that the way our product delivers value here was really, I knew it was really critical for this customer. So I had this conversation and I framed it in this way, or I asked this question to the prospect, and that made them, willing to have a conversation. And then we brought in X individual to help to highlight how that's going to support the prospect, as an example. And so you get into the how. It's not why are we winning and why are we losing? It's how are you going about it? And that's what I think unlocks what good content is.
That's, Honami, I see you nodding as Sophie's talking there. Feel free to add on to that too. It reminds me, when you say like getting into how, I think when you mentioned just like pricing, packaging, it's like, to Hanami's point, not only just like marketing lingo, but just like blanket statements that aren't applicable, like the so what. It does remind me of a conversation to the Compete team over at Shopify when Brock was on the podcast, mentioned one of the things he does. Another unique way to sort of bring Compete into the organization is he has his internal podcast interviews with sellers when they've won a competitive deal or lost, but typically wins over a specific competitor he wants to shed some light on. He interviews them and does exactly what you mentioned there, Sophie. I think they branded it to "What's the deal with that deal?" and super, super popular. Again, it's to your point, bringing other folks in. It's not just about you as a Compete person knowing everything. It's about knowing who knows the things or has experiences or information that's going to unlock for others at scale.
Yeah. When I've talked to the win-loss experts at Klue, what I hear again and again, which is really fascinating, is it's that win-loss information that gets into the how and the actual stories. So it might be to your point, the video of a seller talking about how they lost or how they won. That's the stuff that execs are actually spending hours sitting and listening to. And it's talk about trying to get someone to open your emails. You have an exec who's super busy, spending a few hours digesting that content. That's a sign that is business critical and that's going to get folks' attention. So, it's really important to get into those details and not just be stating facts.
That's a great point. Actually, Ryan Sorley, our VP of Win-Loss here at Klue, was even saying to me a couple of days ago that there's a few customers whose CEO looks at every single win-loss report that comes out. It makes its way to their desk every single time. And I think that is another example of what matters to certain stakeholders and also how do you deliver that story? Because when you're looking at win-loss, inherently competition's involved in some way, and that's an opportunity to put Compete front and center in front of your executive audience.
Exactly.
Honami, I want to get to something a little bit more. I think Sophie mentioned off the top, sort of this like short-term, long-term goals. And we've talked a little bit about some of the like softer ways of like building engagement and things like that. But I do think you also need to sort of have some steps in place or some checkpoints to hit, some things to do. I'd love for you to share maybe some of the steps you'd recommend someone that's listening starting from scratch. What are some of the first things they should be doing to get to this endpoint we're talking about, this healthy Compete program, high adoption rates, a lot of buying? Are there some specific things that a listener could take and run with?
Yeah, every program is going to be a bit different, but I think some cornerstones are making sure that you're focusing your time and attention in the right places. Are we focusing on the right competitors? And if you feel like you're spread too thin or you're not having the impact that you should have on revenue, maybe it's time to consider reprioritizing your competitors. And there's different ways to do that, like looking at CRM data, talking to revenue folks. But making sure, again, that those priorities are aligned with your organization's needs, I would say step one. From there, I would understand what's working, what's not at a basic level about what your sellers or whoever your stakeholders are experiencing. Because again, we can't really apply strategy and tactics until we understand those current pains. What are they missing? Where do they feel like they're lacking competitive support? Or why aren't they coming back to the competitive intel they need? And then from there, we can actually apply best practices of, okay, here's content, recommendations that we can make. Here's how we might restructure our battle cards, or here's how we might provide coverage for some of these competitors that we hadn't talked about yet. And then finally, kind of what you mentioned, Adam, on the executive buy-in, that's definitely key. So making sure that you and your executive team are absolutely aligned on why we are doing this. We're looking to close that competitive revenue gap, making sure that everyone's crystal clear on that, and reporting back on the impact of what your program is having. And we talk a lot about impact, but it's not a one-sided coin. There's, multitude of things that you can do. We at Klue, we run our threat and impact analysis with our customers often, which we can actually do to look at how your revenue metrics are being impacted by compete. Other things like sales confidence is a great metric. If you're getting qualitative feedback from sellers, take screenshots of those messages, keep them in a little slide deck bank so that you can refer to them later on. If you're providing deal support, tracking those deals, whatever you can do to measure and make sure that you're reporting on the impact of the problem you're solving is definitely key to executive buy-in.
We could do an episode on every single one of those steps you mentioned now, Honami. Sophie, when you're listening to Honami, there's any of those steps you want to double click in or share an example of there? It's quite a wide range here.
Yeah, the measuring of success is really interesting. And actually in a meeting earlier today, Honami mentioned this, which is when you're looking at measuring your program and boosting adoption overall, don't hang your hat on one metric. So I've seen customers get too finite in terms of we need to increase win rates. That is critical, without a doubt. But that doesn't tell the whole story of how deal support is impacting the overall business and the direction you're trying to go. It doesn't involve the timeline and all the individuals involved, who's impacting what. So an example would be, we recently did an overview of one of our customers' programs, and we're able to bring in not just the product marketing team that we were working with, but by putting together a story on what is your competitive revenue gap, how has the program influenced it, both from the lens of closing the gap, but also impacting your different revenue metrics and increasing your company's competitive IQ, which is actually proven by sellers, improving overall, but also by to Honami's points, the quotes, like folks are enjoying this and actually engaging with it. That whole story becomes something, and in this case, the CRO was wanting to hop on that call and join and actually understand, how do we take this to the next level? What's working? What's not? These are challenging times for customers, and they're looking for all different reasons and where folks should double down and place their bets. And in my experience, when you're able to tell that story, and especially as someone leading a compete program, tie it to revenue and the success of the business in the next, 6, 9, 12 months, you're going to get a lot greater visibility and actually be moving the needle for the business. So I think, those are some key pieces.
What's interesting there, so when you talk about measuring impact, I think one, thinking about that as you start, thinking out at the end of what am I measuring as I begin? And I like this point is, I think Honami's like, yeah, we do impact analyses. We're measuring competitive revenue gap. And that's critical right now, right? For businesses is to find efficiencies, increase revenue, insert whatever. We understand that. But what's interesting there is ground yourself in that number, but then also bring in all of the different inputs. It's not as simple as X equals Y here. There's a lot of things that go in, and I like that context of like compete IQ, for example, like this competitive IQ that your sales force or product team or whoever, how that's increased. And that actually speaks to the first thing you mentioned, Honami, on like step 1 or 2. I've got bad short-term memory here, about sort of like getting that feedback from revenue teams. Again, one of the things we recommend a lot of the time, and I think one of the things you mentioned with a customer who immediately started seeing adoption across the board, was conducting this confidence survey amongst revenue teams. Could you speak a little bit to like how you use these confidence surveys? And
Yeah. Sales confidence surveys are definitely a great way to capture how folks are feeling. Where do they need help? Are those, are we actually addressing the right competitors? But from an adoption standpoint, I think it serves multiple purposes. So one thing that I like to always, recommend that my customers include in those surveys are feedback about the content. What do you think about the current content? What else would be helpful? If you had a magic wand, what would help you win more against these competitors? And one customer that I'm thinking of, they had some turnover in the organization. They were seeing some low adoption rates. We weren't really sure where revenue folks were at. So we ran that survey and got feedback. And then it really helped us to identify key themes of, okay, here's the type of content that folks need where we don't have yet. Oh, we didn't realize that they wanted coverage on these things. And from there, we were able to actually run a enablement session that wasn't just like, hey, here's Klue, here's the compete content, but actually closing that feedback loop. Kind of similar to like what you would do with your product and your customers, right? So we said, hey, here's what we heard you say, and here are the action items that we can commit to. And there are some things that we actually couldn't commit to, but at least we could say, and here's why, and give that reasoning so that reps aren't feeling like I'm not being heard and then they don't adopt the content. We're closing that feedback loop. And, that's not, again, like a magic hack, but by hearing that feedback and implementing that loop, we were, over the course of 6 months, able to double their adoption rate within Klue, which was really amazing to see.
For people that aren't watching and listening, I'm giving a small clap to Honami there, doing the Lord's work. Sophie, is there anything else as well when you look at this, especially, let's to the starting points there that Honami first mentioned for, again, I'm thinking of the listeners, right, that might be overhauling a program, starting from scratch again. Like the first 1 or 2 checkpoints they should be looking to hit, the thing that gets the ball rolling, getting that early traction. Is there anything maybe you've seen customers do in the past, or just that you'd recommend someone that's looking blank slate? Oh my Lord, where do I go first?
Yeah, they're thinking of boiling the ocean, and I'm don't do it. I think a lot of it, and I know this is maybe sounds oversimplified, but it's just get something out there. The biggest thing I see and hear from customers, especially when they're feeling overwhelmed and getting started, is, but it's not enough. Or I need these 5 competitors completely set up with all the best information, and I need a ton of details included until I actually, share this with my team. And where to start is start with one. Start with your major threat. Go look through, maybe it's Slack or whatever communication channel you use internally. Go check out what name's coming up the most, and then look at your data and look at your CRM and understand where you're losing the most, and then double down and share something to get folks excited. It's okay to say more is coming. The other thing I would do is stay curious. So don't feel like everything that you focus in on has to be set in stone. And that's the thing. It's okay to share an update and then say something shifted. Here's what we've learned more about, and be a bit fluid with the information. And then last but definitely not least in here is we touched on the digest if you're with Klue, but similarly any sort of newsletter, just get something out there. Don't underestimate the value of increasing your team's competitive IQ just by sharing updates. Because we've done tons of surveys with customers, and the thing we see again and again when we ask folks, and these are when we ask sellers how they're how they're learning about competitors, the majority of folks without a structured program are doing the research on their own. So think about how much time that is that they could actually be spending on calls, closing deals. And so don't underestimate the power of an email or a Slack message with those key updates that can spark something for folks, whether they're cold calling or, at the end of a deal and need some information to share.
I love that. The fluidity piece as well. I mean, that just comes part and parcel. Folks that are in the field understand that things don't stay the same. Competitors value props, features, things that the customers care about, things externally in the economic climate that completely shifts people's value, like buyers, what they value most at that point in time. Like, it's always changing. So with that, Intel must be changing. And Honami, I love that example you share about getting feedback from the revenue teams and then not just, we asked for your feedback and now we're going to go away and build. It's, we listened to this, we heard X, Y, Z, and now we're going to present, or here's what we found on the things that we heard you talking about. Because then people are listening, right? Actually, yesterday on the CE Live, Sylvia was mentioning that thing that, like, there's only so many times you can reach out to folks, and there's that moment where they're like, I can keep sharing my thoughts, but if they're not going to listen or act on it, then there's going to be a point where I just stop replying. And so really acting on what you're hearing, I think is really valuable. And I loved hearing that example you're sharing, Honami. We've got producer Ben's favorite segment. Are we ready? It's rapid fire time.
This is why I wanted to be on the podcast.
As with every episode, disclaimer, I have not seen these questions. They're new to me. They're new to my guests. If any get me in hot water or my guests in hot water, send all your complaints to producer Ben at producerben@klue.com. All right, let's get into it. Honami, first up, what's the most weight you've ever deadlifted?
What's the most weight I've ever deadlifted? Last week, 225. I'm a pretty small gal, so I don't think that's insignificant.
What?
For those of you who don't know me, I'm about 5'1" on a good day.
Oh my lord. Sophie, what's the longest meditation session you've ever had?
Glad you didn't ask me the deadlift after Honami answered. 5 pounds. Longest meditation I've ever done is 9 hours.
Like the whole day?
I did a day meditation.
Oh my lord. Honami, can you give our listeners a book recommendation? Can be personal, can be professional, anything you'd like.
Yeah, I'm a big reader. One of the best books I read last year was Pachinko. It's a historical fiction book for anyone who's into that. Looking at the three generations of a Korean family through the span of, I think, like over 100 years. Really great book. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, highly recommend.
Sophie?
Ooh, I recommend any book by Pema Chodron.
Bang. That's many books, but I like it. Last one for both of you. What is one thing you wish for your clients at Klue?
That's such a nice question. Yeah, I hope that, I think we work with a lot of product marketers and CI practitioners, again, who are often in small teams or team of one, and they've got a lot on their plate. I hope that they can have some fun with Compete, like we talked about today, and that it's something that they can really leverage to advance their careers. The best kind of news I hear is when, folks that I work with say, hey, like I was recently promoted, and, they were able to show that the results from the program and, things like that are really personal to their career. So yeah, I hope that every customer who works with us is able to advance their careers in some way, small or large.
I love that. And I would say for me, it's that the meeting you have on your calendar with Klue is the one you look most forward to.
What? Awesome answers for rapid fire. And I don't think we got in trouble in these. That was incredible. Honami and Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today. This was so much fun. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of feedback on this. And listeners, we'll catch you all next week.